So hello everyone, again our community hour for the Open Documentation Academy. Today, after a brief intro, Bram is going to be talking about what we can learn for documentation from old documentation or places or materials that you might not have thought about as inspiration. So I'm looking forward to that. I believe that he's going to be specifically talking about what we can learn from old synth manuals. Outside of that, let me just preface that with saying that I'm very happy that we reached the milestone of 50 closed issues for the Academy. It was actually just yesterday that I was able to close a 50th issue in the queue. So I think that's a really nice achievement. And yeah, we're a little bit behind with adding new stuff into the queue. So either please bear with us, or if you have ideas about what could be added, of course, even welcoming outside projects does not have to be related to Ubuntu or Canonical. We're happy to feature those as well, as long as we would have somebody to guide them, those issues through the process. And with that, let me give it over to Graham.
Thanks, Robert. Let me just start up sharing my screen. When I was thinking of something that was perhaps a little more, not that the things that we do aren't fun, but something it's a bit untested. I don't really know what synthesizer manuals have to say to help us with documentation, but I'm really interested in old manuals and old documentation in general. And I hope it's not just my age, but I remember a time when Linux distributions came with huge manuals and or compilers. I've got a set of ring-bound manuals for the Lattice C compiler, and I used to love those things. And I know that everything has moved online, and in fact, maybe manuals aren't even relevant anymore. But I think synthesizers are a good slice of that kind of history because they start a long time ago, but they start being used more regularly in the 1950s and then the 1960s. And I thought, if this is interesting, we could do other things like what can we learn from Unix manuals or recipe books, or I don't know, even old vinyl record covers. I think are really interesting in their own way, the way that they cram so much information into so little space and kind of demand your attention in different ways. And I did think that this would just be about synthesizer manuals, and then this here is a picture of a Mini Moog, which is kind of the first readily available synthesizer that became popular in like the 1970 it came out. But there were too many synthesizers, and I couldn't find a way of restricting them. So in fact, this is mostly about synthesizer manuals. Polyphonic synths are where you can hold down more than one key at the same time, and they'll produce more than one note. And I've done that because I wanted to find a way of contrasting the way that manuals have changed for polyphonic synthesizers over, well, it'll be over in 30 years or 40 years, because even this year, in 2024, people are creating new polyphonic synthesizers that have an awful lot in common with the synthesizer that you can see on the screen, which is a Yamaha CS-80. And it's very interesting, or I find it interesting, comparing the manual that came with the CS-80 and the manual that comes with a modern synth. And right in the middle of all that, we have the transition from analog synthesizers, where everything was kind of a discrete component or a cable, to integrated circuits, and then digital synthesizers, where everything's done basically in a CPU. So the manuals for these devices actually cover that whole period, and I think is very reflective of software and what becomes software documentation, and is always technical documentation, especially in the beginning, where these devices were made for musicians or technical people to provide a certain sound in a recording. They weren't meant as consumer products. They were meant as professional pieces of equipment because they cost thousands and thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars, like in the CS-80's case. And so there's also a transition from synthesizers being these utilitarian things to an extent, while also being used for expression, to now where, I mean, many synthesizers are very cheap and consumer driven and everybody can use them. And there, of course, there are software synthesizers available for free. I've got to be careful because I can talk for too long about synthesizers. So I'm going to start. These are so the reasons why I think synthesizer manuals are interesting for us as documentarians is that they attempt to solve the same problems. At their core, the synthesizers are quite complicated in what they do. There's signal processing involved, and there's a flow from no sound or chaos into creating something that's expressive and is beautiful, perhaps, if that's what you want them. And as I said, they evolved over the decades, so it's interesting to see how things have stayed the same or changed. And synthesizers have become more complicated, just like software has. And it's interesting to see how those challenges are kind of incorporated into the documentation. So the best place to start, even though it's a monosynth, and I said I'm only going to look at polysynths, is the mini Moog. So I'm going to do this by actually looking at the manuals. I've got 8. This is the first one because this is where it all begins. But the 8 that I've chosen are polysynths generally from the same manufacturers, and you can see how the manufacturer has changed their approach to documentation as the synthesizers have evolved. And the mini Moog being the first is the best place to start. And this, I mean, if you've ever heard of the mini Moog, it was created by Bob Moog in the late 60s and released in the 70s. And this is basically Bob Moog's manual of the mini Moog. And the synthesizer itself is very, very simple compared to modern synthesizers. It only creates one sound. And you can see how the manual has well, it's put together on a typewriter, although I think this is a modern recreation of it. But what I think is interesting is it needs more kind of introduction to what synthesizers are. But very, very early on, it sets up what is basically a get started tutorial. And this is basically plug in your device and set all the dials to these parts here. If you do that and press a key on the keyboard and you've got it connected to a speaker or headphones, it will create a pleasant sound. And that's, I think, really interesting because you need some kind of compass bearing for what a piece of equipment or piece of software does. And without that setting up very early on, you may struggle for the whole time and give up. It's so easy with a synthesizer and with software to completely lose your way and have no idea what anything is doing. But by setting you up first with this kind of initial success and all of these kind of default values, Bob Moog is saying, whatever you do, however you experiment, you can always move back to this. And I think that's a foundation of a lot of technical documentation, and we do it with our tutorials and our get started sections. I won't spend too much time on this. All of these manuals actually are quite available online if you search for them. Archive.org has got a lot of them, especially the older ones archived. But a few interesting things, I think. The illustrations, there are illustrations, but they're very minimal, and they're very oversimplified compared to the actual synth itself, and I think that's important. And because they had no way of doing this, it's 24 pages long, but they keep adding a page as they updated the synth over the years. So it starts in 1970, and I think the last edition was in 1971. And so I think actually it does very well in just 22 pages. And I often find myself looking at documents like this if I don't know where to start with a technical piece of software. So going back to the slide, I did create the mini Moog. These are the things that I kind of took from that manual: the getting started, the tutorials, the minimal illustrations, and oh yeah, there's no kind of bold or italics, but they do capitalize words in the documentation that correspond directly to the words on the synth, which I think is like a precursor to hyperlinking or having terms that you commonly use in your specific software. So that's the last monosynth. I'm going to go on to the CS-80, which is perhaps the most powerful synthesizer, especially of the late 70s, and was famously used by Vangelis for things like the Blade Runner soundtrack in Antarctica and Chariots of Fire. Now, this is a much more complicated beast, as you can probably tell from the front of it, and this is also reflected in the manual, although they still only do this in 56 pages. But you can see that it's already setting the tone for how complicated this beast is, although I really like this early annotation, which really is kind of reference, but they understand that you're always going to have to go back to this to see what all of the different sliders and knobs and things do. And if you, yeah,
I'm sorry to interject. You're not sharing the manual.
Oh, thanks, Robert. I've forgotten to change the tab. Sorry, thanks, Robert. This is the CS-80 manual, and on the third page, it's got this kind of annotated diagram of what the synth actually does. What all of the knobs do, and there are many of them, and there's 46 of them, and this would be considered reference material, I think. But having it at the very beginning, which is exactly where you need it, makes a lot of sense. And if you actually, I've never used one of these, but later on I'll talk about a software version of the same synth. This is basically what you come back to, or you'll use as a tooltip. The other really important thing is that it doesn't have any explanatory text compared to the Mini Moog, where they had to kind of describe what synthesizers are. This very first column here on the left is actually, here on the left, I don't know if we can highlight it, is actually the equivalent of the getting started. The quick setup instructions actually tell you how to create that pleasing sound out of it. So you're already set up for success and know how to get back to a standard state. But then, unfortunately, or maybe because you spent so much money on the synthesizer, this manual in particular gets very complicated very, very quickly, and uses lots of illustrations that aren't necessarily very clear. Also assumes a certain amount of expertise in music notation and the ideas around synthesis. So these things cost $20,000 or $30,000 even at the beginning. So maybe they've had to feel like they gave value to it. And we'll see later on how this contrasts to later polyphonic synths, but also a software version of this exact synth. I'll try and remember to go back to the right tab. So things that I took from this, the cheat sheet at the very beginning is really useful. The tutorial is now even earlier, but yes, there are too many photos. And as we're covering the software later on, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how a modern approach might be. So the next synth for the manual that I'm going to look at is the Jupiter-8, which is, after the CS-80, it's used in many, many pop records of the 80s, and it's still a very distinctive sound in modern music because of the kind of strings that it gave. Is, I guess, I don't want to talk too much about the sound. So let me can't get to the next page on here. This is the Jupiter-8 manual, and this is, whereas previously the CS-80 was by Yamaha, this is a manual from the Roland Corporation. This is actually from, just looking at my notes, 1981. So I think it looks incredibly modern considering this is from 1981, and it's Roland trying to kind of define their style. And they've obviously taken inspiration from Yamaha and describing the CS-80. They do, however, move into function and descriptive elements of, rather than going into a tutorial. There's no such thing here. Maybe because the idea of pressing a button and getting a sound out. Yeah, and the 80s fonts. And in fact, Roland still uses these fonts now. However, if you take a look at this, not now because I'm just scrolling through it quickly, it's quite high level and quite easy to understand. And you can see that it's 32 pages. It actually covers every single function of what is quite a complicated synthesizer. And I think what's interesting here is that we're seeing the benefits of great design. Of course, times have changed, whereas the CS-80 is a mess of cables when you open it up. And so it wasn't possible to perhaps simplify it any much further than they already did because of the restrictions of the hardware at the time. Despite still being based on analog technology, the Jupiter-8 has integrated circuits and is a lot simpler on the circuits, so that they could perhaps lay things out and aggregate functions in a much more useful way than they could with the CS-80. So the result is that the synth is a lot easier to understand and use, and also perhaps more productive because of it. And I think the manual reflects that. I'll go back to my slides. So my key takeaways from this are, yeah, great hardware design basically affects the complexity of the manual, and that's one of the big things that I struggle with in terms of software documentation, because a lot of the complexity that I end up having, that I or we end up having to work around in documentation, is a result of these kind of design choices that have gone into the architecture of the software, just as they had with the CS-80 and the Jupiter-8. And it may be because, you know, there are certain security considerations or the way the Linux kernel works that enforce that kind of approach, or it may just be bad design. And it's something that we try to do as a documentation team at Canonical, is work closer with the design teams and get involved in the conversations around how software is developed at those early stages, precisely to try and avoid creating this problem where we have to document around poorly designed software or features. So this all changes with the next one, which is the Yamaha DX-7. This is basically the first very popular digital synthesizer. There's no analog components at all. The sound in it is generated from a processor, and it is called frequency modulation synthesis, and it kind of dominated music throughout the 80s. What's interesting about the DX-7 is that it became, in the 80s at least, the biggest selling synthesizer of the time, and I think sold over 100,000 units, whereas the Mini Moog, the first synth we looked at, sold 10,000 by the same time. So it became a lot cheaper, but by contrast, the DX-7 is horrendously complicated. So we've got to a time now where people are just pressing the buttons and playing the sounds that the synth comes out, rather than trying to understand how the synth works. And I think that's interesting. That says a lot about modern software, and perhaps should it just work without you having a manual? I'm going to show you the DX-7 manual now, but you can see first that this screen is just tiny. It's basically an LCD display. And so if I go to the manual, I'll make sure I share the tab just on the. So this is the DX-7. So remember, the DX-7 sold many. It is hugely popular, and it still has a very distinctive sound. I mean, it became part of every sound card in the 90s. But I mean, I just have to scroll through this. The setup is relatively straightforward, but frequency modulation itself, this is still dealing with the hardware, is difficult to understand, but very difficult to intuitively understand, to the point where you know how to create. You have an idea for a sound, and then you want to create it. And you can see the combination of using a small LCD screen and frequency modulation, which is changing the shape of one waveform with the shape of another waveform, makes, I mean, I've tried to read this and it's very difficult. So this manual, though, is still only 32 pages, because it doesn't really go into the depths of how any of this frequency modulation actually works. It just introduces the subject. And there is an additional manual that comes along with this if you want to find out more. What's interesting about this is I think it represents the transition to early software. Did I put anything? Yeah, the dawn of software, and basically it's preset driven. So most people using the DX-7 used it as it was configured. So software with just one button, basically. So digital synthesis became very business-like. This is the Roland JV-1080, which is basically the descendant of the Roland Jupiter-8. If you think about everything becoming digital, whereas the Jupiter-8 had 8 analog voices, this has got 64. So it became the workhorse of music production studios. It's not you can see by its aesthetics, it's not meant to be creatively inviting. And as we saw earlier on, this is also kind of reflected in the very businesslike Roland manual for the JV-1080. However, this is one of my favorites. It's 166 pages to describe every feature of the JV-1080, and that's because the digital revolution has basically allowed them to throw absolutely every feature into a box, and that's exactly what the JV-1080 does. It's still used today, despite the fact that it came out in 1994. There are descendants of this, but people still use it, and it's not terribly distinctive. It's used for fill-in sounds. It's really great for what they call pads. The preview's not working, but this is very much the style. It's still Roland text, and I like the way that it's done. It's very comprehensive, and you can it tells you everything. If you do have a problem with this, you can always, it's really good to navigate and find, if I reload it, whether I can actually get better through it. No, I can't preview any more than this for some reason. But yes, it's one of my favorite manuals, despite the fact that it's 166 pages, but it's very dry. But it tells you, I think it's very well structured and very well organized and quite hands-on. Everything is focused around making sounds. So everything that you do has a direct change in the sound that you're doing. So here in this tone selection, for example, if you're playing one sound and you press a button, the sound will change, and you can turn the button off and on again. And the manual's written in that way that you can see basically the output of the changes that you've input. What have I got next? The next one is basically the last great polysynth. I see I've put synth for business for the Roland, and that is the Alesis Andromeda. This came at a time, I think, in 2000, where creating analog synths had become very expensive and untenable. So there's a certain kind of craft element to the A6 manual, but also in a way that it wants to make you feel like you've bought something special in the way that you didn't with the JV-1080, which was very work person-like. This is also a very good manual, I feel. Alesis did a very good job, but you can see that the way it's organized, it's not great structure. There's a getting started section like we saw with the Mini Moog and also with the CS-80, but then it's actually very difficult until you know the synth better, and you can only do that through experimentation, what all of these sections actually mean. I mean, most people aren't going to know what oscillators and filters are, so you have to have actually played with the synths for some time. So in terms of structure, the documentation fails, but in terms of comprehensiveness, it's very good. It's a pity the previews aren't working. But you can see it's comprehensive and it's detailed, and that's something that the earlier manuals didn't have other than the JV-1080. Every single feature, every single parameter is documented here. So yeah, the last polysynth, and the manual kind of reflects that. The synth was ultimately unsuccessful because it cost so much to produce. It came with 3 manuals. That was just the user guide. Interestingly, there's a maintenance manual that came with the Andromeda that you don't see on other synths, which tells you how to maintain the hardware, because the hardware is already becoming obsolete when the synth was made. So we're on to the 7th synth, and this is a software recreation of the CS-80 that we saw earlier on, the one from the late 70s, the big polysynth that Vangelis used. And what's interesting with this is that these software recreations don't have this one at least doesn't have official affiliation with the original CS-80. It's a re-engineered in software version of it that mimics all of the features. So they have to write their own manual to go along with this. They can't just rely on people using the CS-80 manual. So this came out in 2005, and we can see that, I'll show the manual in a minute, the attitudes have changed. Not only is this software, but attitudes have changed in the way that they're describing what was the complicated CS-80 manual. I'll share this tab. This is the CS-80V, it's called V, I guess, for virtual, by Arturia. And Arturia has made the last synth that I'll look at in a minute. Starts with a load of thanks. It's a pity that the render. Let me see if I can fix that by refreshing it. The rendering isn't working. If not, I will. I've got it downloaded here. So in fact, this has become more of a, because it's software, they actually have an introduction where they try and lend the software some credibility by talking about the great synths of the past, which is the kind of thing that we've already been through. So even before you get to the sound, they're assuming that you know what this sounds like. And then they show some credentials here of how accurate their emulation of the old synthesizer is before they've even got into using their synth. And that doesn't really start until here. This being software, there are screenshots, but they actually do a much better job of teaching you how to use the CS-80 than, if you can remember, the CS-80 manual does. I mean, it's exactly the same thing. It has all it doesn't sound exactly the same, but it has all the same features. The presets are much different, but none of this was in the CS-80. But this is 126 pages. I'm not sure what this says, except for the CS-80, the people who wrote the CS-80 manual didn't anticipate that people would want to know every single nuance of the device. They'd expect people to experiment and find out what they liked about it without having to understand how it works. However, in the software world, they've basically explained every single nuance because they've probably spent time coding that feature, and part of coding that feature was writing some documentation on that feature, and it's all in this manual. So just to finish, I've got one last synthesizer, and it's, so this software here, CS-80V, was created by Arturia, which was a software company, but interestingly, they started to create hardware, and this came out just this year. It's an analog polysynth, so it's analog. It hasn't. It's, of course, it's got its own. It's got a couple of powerful CPUs in there. It's got a screen, and it's obviously got digital, lots of digital elements. But in fact, the signals, the sound is generated through an analog signal path. So it's very much a modern recreation of the CS-80 or of the Jupiter-8 or of the Alesis Andromeda, and we've switched now from utilitarian in studio, add something to a sound, professional circles, and this is 3,000, 4,000 euros, so it's still very expensive, but it's also bridged over into a kind of the world of wealthy synth consumers, and that is reflected in the manual. If I see if I can switch to the Polybrute 12, it's called the Polybrute 12 if I've not mentioned that. So it starts off very much like the CS-80V manual that we just saw, the software, but there's a big congratulatory part, and I think we see that a lot in modern documentation. The tone becomes much more casual. They're not afraid to say, well done for buying this, and you're going to get so much out of this journey. And I think that's quite compelling. I mean, not just because you spent 4,000 euros on something that basically only makes a sound, but because they want to assure you that the time invested in learning something is time well spent, because you will reap the rewards of learning something. And this is something I'd not seen on any of the others, is an overview of what the synth does in terms of simple text terms. And that's a bit of a sales pitch. But now you can see that this is 137 pages. In fact, the Alesis Andromeda was the biggest manual in all of this. So I think that was kind of peak excessiveness when it came to features in the synth and one-to-one mapping for all of those features in the manual. And I think this is probably the clearest of all, because they're documenting a hardware synthesizer. They have to explain its functionality. It does start with a quick start, but what I do like about it is that, like the CS-80V, they're documenting the synth as they would a piece of software. They've basically taken the device itself and taken this as the user interface, which the other manuals don't do. The other manuals typically try and copy the signal flow of the synthesizer where the audio is traveling through the hardware. This is like a look at the user interface, which has been designed to mimic the signal flow, but that's, I think, what you would do with software. And I think it's very, very good for it. This is from this year. So you can see that the descriptions are very short. The diagrams are clear and bullet list. There's no thick, dense pieces of text, even though the synth is probably just as complicated as all the rest of them. So I didn't want to go too much into all of these, but yes, I think that is the manual there is the combination of hardware and software and everything that has been learned in synthesizer manuals before. And I think it's the same. We see the same thing in technical writing, and it'd be really interesting actually to look at old software manuals and compare them to how online software is documented. I actually meant to mention that one of the most popular synthesizers of this current era is a synthesizer called Surge that came out in the 2000s, and it's used on all kinds of electronic dance music. It's purely software, it's ubiquitous, and that doesn't have a manual. And a lot of software synthesizers don't have a manual, and so these are very much kind of outliers, I think, in the world of music production and things that create sounds. But sticking to these kind of classic analog polysynths shows the way that I think documentation has progressed and what's important, because I think what's important in these synth manuals is also what's important in our own documentation. And something I didn't mention is that I think more by accident than anything that almost everything that they wrote, even not the organization of it, could be almost exactly mapped to the Dear Taxis framework. It's usually explanation or it's usually how to, and there's always a reference section at the back, and the tutorial could be that very brief getting started. And they reflect that it's much more clearer in those manuals than it is in modern software, for example, if that's what you're looking for. So that's it. Thanks for being patient with me. I'm happy to answer any questions on synthesizer manuals that I may be able to answer, or actually anything else at all. I don't mind.
Thank you, Graham. That was weirdly inspiring, and also your enthusiasm about these kind of machines as well as those manuals is.
I tried to limit the enthusiasm.
No, it still shone through.
Actually, and that's something that I wanted to mention, even if you don't feel that way about the software documentation that you might be, or the software you're working on, I think it's important to try and pretend to be enthusiastic about it and let people know that they've made the right decision.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking about a book that I bought, I believe it was like 1990, and that it was about Turbo Pascal. I think it was version 5 back then, and it was a huge book. It had like 600 pages, and it was all typed on a typing machine. And then what they did was they used one of the old copying machines to scale it down and put it into a book that was then bound. It was very interesting, but I loved it, and it had a very interesting approach to teaching you the language and how to use it for coding, because it started with complex examples. There was like no hello world thing. You started out programming, I don't remember, it was possibly a game or something, not entirely useful, but it was a very complex example, and it deconstructed the example meticulously and took it apart on many pages, every single part of the program and of the libraries that it used, and based on that, it explained in great detail all that you could do with the language. And I found it extremely helpful. And basically, you read the book, and it was supposed to be read from start to finish, even though it had a reference section at the end. But you read the book, and it was like learning about I don't know, like the new world or something like that. Where somebody presented it to you, they showed what it could do, and then it took it apart and explained every single piece, what it did, what was its function, why you did it that way, and how you could do it slightly differently to modify the behavior. And I've never seen that in any other, either programming or computer manual. It probably wouldn't make sense with software. But yeah, unfortunately, I couldn't find it. I was trying to find it, but somehow it disappeared, and I only have the boring manuals that were left from the later versions. But I thought I'd mention that it was an interesting approach.
Graham, that was really interesting. It was interesting to me that in one of the first manuals you showed, when it was kind of like a wooden box with lots of knobs in it, and you said that, if you look at the diagrams, they were quite abstract representations of the physical hardware. Like they didn't attempt to show everything, just the salient details. But then as you kind of moved through the ages and looked at the increasingly digital manuals, they began to describe things in exhaustive detail as, I guess, they became more digital. And you said like one of the reasons for that might be that the fact that people who are coding these features are also documenting these features, and the documentation is available. But I'm just wondering, do you think there's something about I guess, the difference between a tangible physical device and then as you move into the more, I guess, abstract digital world, that maybe there's a tendency to over-explain?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think you're right. I think with the Mini Moog, with the first synth, it was only a very small company. Unfortunately, it's owned by Gibson or somebody else now, but they purposefully didn't document everything into the same detail because it was expected that you would discover it for yourself. And they were unapologetic about that. And I think that you're right. I think that's quite a good. That's quite empowering, because I always feel if something's incomplete, it needs to be written. But
yeah, because if they tell you, move this knob to 2 o'clock and this knob to 4 o'clock, and you try it and it goes, yeah, that sounds pleasant. But of course, you're then going to subsequently, move the knobs, and they don't have to tell you, try this pleasant sound and this pleasant sound. And I guess in the later models, you probably would have had sound banks or example songs that they would have pre-prepared for you already. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
I wonder if it's because they're basically creative devices, and so they can't really tell you what it is that you want because they don't know what it is you want. Whereas it's not the same.
I think I have your answer, because I think I call that self-sorting documentation. So I'm holding here a copy of something which won't now appear, called Lyon's Commentary on Unix, 6th edition. And if you open it, there's one page where there's a dedication, and then all of a sudden, it's just code with these little handwritten comments that you can't really see, but it's handwritten in a very sloppy hand, and it's just been photocopied into a book. So literally, you're learning Unix by going through and looking at the code and reading the little comments he's put in there. Didn't even bother to put them in the code, just put them in the margins, basically. And people complained about it, and he said, well, if you don't get it, the book's not for you. If you can't figure the synthesizer out, the book's not going to help you, kind of thing. If you can't figure Unix out, nothing's going to help you. You got to just read the code. So I think there is a category of, I guess, like I said, self-sorting documentation. It pushes away people that really probably would not benefit from this, whatever it is you're trying to document or whatever you're trying to use. I don't know. Are musicians like that? Are they, I don't want to read, I just want to play with it?
I would imagine they're the same as us. Some of them do just want to play with it, and some of them want to study every single detail. Depends on the music they're making, I suppose. If you're, there are groups out there that create very algorithmic, intricate programmatic pieces of music that I assume they've, you know, worked on for a long time, even written code. I mean, I know that some artists write DSP code to create the sounds they want to create. In fact, I have to limit myself. I could do a whole one of these on just sequencer manuals, which are the manuals that come along the software and the hardware for programming the notes and the music.
Graham,
that's different.
I just looked at a handbook for a DAW, a digital audio workstation that I use. So that's I guess a way you can make music without using any physical device. It's just some software that lives in your computer, and that manual's about 500 pages,
Wow.
exhaustively described. And that software has, you know, tool tips and everything embedded in it as well. So it's incredibly comprehensive, but also, I guess, something that's designed to be searchable on a computer, so you don't necessarily have to read it from start to front. You can jump in and out.
Yeah, I resisted the urge to ask geeky questions when you finish, like, when you're using the pure digital synth, can you hear the Fourier transforms, whereas you can't in the analog? Can you hear them in the analog digital hybrid? Which means nothing to like 90% of the people on this call, probably, but
I do want to ask, I mean, do you think manuals are still relevant? Are they still the way to go? Is it have they become anachronistic? I mean, I love them, but
I think I would have a very hard time reading a 500-page technical manual. I think if there was a well-written, you know, 50 to 80-page manual with good diagrams and describing the main features and giving some ideas to take it further myself, I think I would love that. But I think that's rare these days.
Yeah, of course.
I was just going to say, I haven't read very many analog synth manuals, but there's a very interesting parallel with something that goes back even further in time, which is manuals that came with cameras. In the early days of cameras, because the person taking the photograph was not just the photographer, but had to be sort of an expert in handling film and all the other things. And there weren't very many controls on early cameras, but everything was reasonably well explained in the manual. You knew why you were doing things because it would tell you, you know, make sure you close this window before you open this, otherwise the light will get in and your film will be ruined. And then as we progress nowadays, when you buy a camera and it comes with a manual, it sort of tells you the menu options, but it doesn't explain why you would want to use any of those things. And a lot of people, you know, who buy a new Nikon or Canon digital camera, then end up buying like extra books to learn how to use it, like how to actually take a photograph with it. So it's sort of interesting, but it is also about the difference between someone who has bought something and is using it because they're interested in the thing, and someone who is only interested in the result of the thing. And I guess that's sort of what happened to synths in the 80s, 90s. People became less interested in the exploring how to create beautiful music, and more interested in how do I make it sound like this so that I can go on top of the pops or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I use a piece of software called Ableton Live, and that doesn't have a printed manual, but I really wish it did, because a bit like Robert saying earlier on about the Pascal manual, I need to get away from the screen and go and sit somewhere and read a book. And I love reading a physical copy of something. I hope it's not just my age, but I need the context shift that isn't just learning in front of a screen, that isn't trying to do everything by clicking on something and seeing what happens. Like those camera manuals. Peter's actually asked a really great question. Do you think the technical writers who created these manuals had to be proficient with synths, or just had to learn the source for what was needed to create these manuals? I'm curious about what you think the standard for hiring these technical writers were, considering the complexity and level of details required. Well, that's a question you could just ask ourselves as well in terms of the software we've documented.
I think it depends on what you're doing and how complicated it is and how hard it is to express what you're trying to do. I would think with a synthesizer, you'd want somebody who is musically inclined, because you're going to be describing things that other people have to relate to, and you have to be able to relate to them. I can flip that on its head.
You know,
yeah, oh, I can. Yeah. I guess I can flip that on its head. I mean, for Maz, my second interview was all about networking. If I didn't pass the networking test like any other developer, I wasn't in. That's not normal for a technical author. But they didn't want to have to take time to explain. So I think it depends on the field and the situation.
Mm.
Per Nick's example, I can't imagine somebody writing a camera manual who doesn't know how to use a camera.
I don't know, because it offers a unique opportunity for someone to come in, especially if they're a technical writer, for example. Then they have the skills to ask the right questions, and then coming in perhaps not knowing so much about cameras or synthesizers means they're going to ask questions that are unique to people who are new to those cameras and synthesizers, which is what somebody selling those things will want them to do. But at the same time, they're going to have to become familiar enough with the technology at some point to have those insights that you're talking about, Bill, and understand that it needs to be comprehensive enough, and they need to ask the right questions when it comes to the technical details. So I do think it really reflects our professions a lot.
I think it's similar to other professions as well. Like, you know, if there is a programmer who is very familiar with one language, but haven't really heard or haven't really coded anything in a different language, chances are that they're going to be, in a much better position trying to learn that other language than somebody who is completely new to programming. And that translates to technical writing as well. Like if you're really proficient with, being able to write about something like, let's say, hardware, you probably would be, it's probably going to be easier for you to pick up on, writing about something completely different. Like it could be, manuals about cars or whatever, or software, or I don't know, whatever else. But at some point, you're going to be, in a position where the domain knowledge is going to be required. Now, of course, if somebody is writing about, jet engines, they still need to have an understanding, but probably nobody's going to ask them to go and test it. Whereas with, writing about software, it's quite probable that you're going to have that kind of knowledge or expertise to be able to actually go through those instructions and test it and set up your testing environment and things like that. So that domain knowledge becomes critical then.
I saw this triangle one time. I've been looking for it forever, that has like 3 axes on it. And it's about people's personalities and skills and what jobs they fit. And it's got, I don't know, maybe learning and remembering and all that. But anyway, got all these jobs around the triangle. And right in the center of the triangle is technical author. Because it's believed that they have to have an equal amount of all 3 of these in order to be able to do their job. They have to be able to switch to any one of these corners of the triangle without getting lost. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm still looking for that after years of having seen it and not captured it.
Go for it, Sally.
Speaking of things being lost, the thing that kind of struck me as you were showing like the earlier manuals, where obviously the tech is much simpler than the later ones, but but also I guess there's some aspect of like wanting to have shorter manuals because of like cost saving on paper and like not having to print as much. But do you think that something's been lost in the kind of discipline of deciding what to document and not to document? Because now we can just document everything.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think you're right. There's been a couple of points in the chat. Iqbal said, I understand and mostly sympathize with the argument on paperback books. However, that position, just as with earlier guided exploration instead of explicit manual, seems to be a privileged one. And yes, it's kind of discipline, isn't it? Just because printing would make us kind of focus on the cost of something and the efficiency of it, it doesn't mean that we can't also do that with our own documentation. I mean, Daniele has a thing that he likes to say, that we shouldn't be paid for the words that we write. We should be paid for the words that we take out of the documentation. And I think there's definitely some truth, because there's some connection to like, this feature is brilliant because I've written 1,000 words about it, but really it might just be turn it on. Shane said, when I was a teacher recently, the majority of students still printed the notes and slides. Yeah. It's similar to wanting to write things down, even on a tablet or whatever it happens to be. I find it easier to actually write things down. I don't suppose I'm writing it down for retrieval from what I've written, but as a way of programming my brain.
Well, I saw Jeffrey up there said, I tend to look for answers via search engine before opening a manual. That has a name now. It's called the Jarvis effect, after the AI in the Marvel movie universe. I don't know the AI, but whatever it is, because you tend to rely on crowd wisdom versus your own wisdom, and that's what documentation really is all about, right? A little bit of crowd wisdom.
Yes, Simon.
Coming also from the education field, I've got a piece on that too. The printing and writing. So biologically, as learners and having that kinesthetic connection of writing words, connecting it to our mind, actually increases our recall and learning ability. So I totally agree with students who want to print out the slides so they can handwrite. Just think about typing buttons or touching a screen. There's very little kinesthetic connection. Even just basic memory recall by using fingers. You see some people using their hands in different motions to do math. So it's a huge piece to be able to have that access. Doesn't necessarily speak so much to the documentation, but still, like for learning and pleasure, I prefer real paper. How-tos and stuff, yeah, I'm searching just like everybody who's mentioned that in the comments. But if I really need to get into understanding it, I want to be able to underline and write and scroll, because I know that it's a better way to learn. Yeah, thanks.
I think there's a lot of probably psychological stuff going on. Like I mentioned, the Raspberry Pi manual. It's just a PDF that comes in a folder called Bookshelf in the home directory, and it's a PDF that's styled very much like a printed book. And I'm sure there are people who print it out. But for me, when I see something that's styled that way, even if I don't intend to print it out, I think immediately some switch goes in my brain where I think, this is something I want to read. Like, this is something I want to read chapter to chapter. I want to progress through this thing. I want to download this on my tablet so I can read it in an ebook reader or something like that. Whereas if it's a website where you have clickable hyperlinks in a table of contents in a sidebar, immediately I go to just jumping all around it, which is kind of the, I guess, the internet mindset. So I think there's something about the physical medium, as Simon says, the touch and the feel, and I guess sometimes the ease with which you can, improvise with switching from drawing to writing without necessarily having to, for example, switch to a different software program. but also there's something about the conventional, traditional format of the book that makes you want to go through it in a linear way.
I also like. Okay, an example that when I owned a Commodore 64, I bought the Commodore 64 Programmer's Reference Guide, which was a ring-bound book of magic. It was a magic tome that had all sorts of secret spells that they didn't tell you anywhere else, like how to draw, how to manipulate the sprites and things like that. There was it was sort of like there was a lot of machine code in there as well, but there were mistakes in it, and there were things that weren't explained, but it had quite wide margins. So my copy of the Programmer's Reference Guide has all sorts of little notes in it, like, oh yeah, and if you flip this bit, then this happens. And it became like a proper spell book with, you know, that I could annotate and update and correct the mistakes in. And that was invaluable. I must work out where I put that book, actually.
That's really interesting, Nick. It makes me think, like, I don't know, maybe there's something like this, but for online documentation, is there an equivalent to that? Something like where you could have almost something like a personally annotated copy?
That would be brilliant. Imagine the GG documentation, but with your own notes on it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And maybe we could end on a comment by Jeffrey in the comments. I find that searches give me the perspective from a user's point of view rather than a manufacturer's point of view, and I can write a very precise query to take me to the exact issue. But with a manual, I have to figure out what vocabulary the manufacturer is calling a component of its device. For example, as a user of an oscilloscope, I might want to know why the waves are taller or shorter, and the manufacturer will label that as amplitude. As a user, we often don't know what the manufacturer calls it. Yeah, that's something I could have brought out about synth manuals. Actually, they all do the same thing, but often Roland and Yamaha have completely different terms for exactly the same thing.
That's a pretty serious indictment of documentation as a whole. We tend to get lost in our terminology. And once we learn the product, then all of a sudden we become experts and we forget to explain what we're talking about.
Well, I think that's been an hour.
Yeah. Well, this was really interesting. Thank you, Graham.
Yes, absolutely.